Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Taboda. I am the education reporter for the Austin American-Statesman, and today we are going to be talking about state school finance. And with me today I have Noel Gandelerian. He is the president of the Texas State Teachers Association, and State Representative Gina Hinojosa, and the CFO of Austin ISD, Nicole Conley Johnson. So the first couple questions, I'm just going to kind of throw it out, and any of you can answer them. I'll have some more direct questions for each of you a little bit later. But just to open, how would you describe the current state of school finance in Texas?
I'm going to give the floor to Gina first.
Oh, okay. Well, it's broken, and that is, I'm highly partisan, which might be surprising to some, but that is an opinion held widely across party line. The school finance system is broken, and most in the Texas House believe that we need to invest more money into public education. Of course, the challenge is, where do we get that money and who gets it? And that's what we've been fighting over for decades.
Any other thoughts?
Well, outside of being just sort of undeniably broken, as sort of the courts have sort of asserted, I would say that it needs to be realigned with our expectations for what we student performance and outcomes, right? There's a huge gap between how districts are funded and how much they're provided for to ensure that every student has access to the curriculum and an education they need to be successful in college and life. And so for those reasons, and as well as the outdatedness in the system, some of these weights and indexes haven't had substantial or meaningful updates for 30 years. So that in and of itself necessitates a hard look at sort of revamping the formula, but certainly it needs to be realigned with what we expect for our students to know so that they can be sufficiently supported through the resources and tools and strategies that districts will utilize and ensuring that all students have what they need. So realignment and the outdatedness necessitates some careful attention.
Mm-hmm. Right, and it definitely is inadequate and broken. Doesn't matter what part of the state you go to, you see the inequities in the system. Even oftentimes, within school districts, when you heavily rely on property taxes, to fund our public schools, you see the disparity from one community to the next, sometimes in neighboring communities. When there's that type of disparity so close to each other, then the system is broken, which is something that we desperately need our legislature to address and fix, and really listen to those that are in elected office at the local school board level to help meet the needs of all of our students across the state, regardless of where they live.
And can I just add one more thing?
Mm-hmm.
Another challenge with finding a solution for public education finance and funding is that it is not a sexy issue. And so it is often not prioritized by our politicians. And so we saw this last special session, or the last regular session, that the issue was hijacked by the voucher issue, which is a highly partisan issue that there is not support for in the House. And so one of what everybody can do is make sure when you vote that you are vocal about why you're voting and that this is a priority for you. And if you haven't voted in the primaries, I would urge everybody, if you can get home if you live here, polls are open till 7 and you can vote anywhere, but it's especially important we vote in our primaries, because most people don't, and that's why we have these polarized politics where we're fighting over vouchers, which is not the concern of most Texans.
So given some of the issues that you guys raised, what elements of the finance system do you think need to be tackled or fixed first?
I would say, one, sort of the mechanics of the formula itself, updating things like the cost of education index, the transportation allotment. The basic allotment itself only provides $5,140 per student. Those basic sort of components of the funding system need to be addressed discreetly, and I would say that should sort of take priority. We also need to look at some of the weights and indexes that are sort of account for the variability of our student populations that we serve. We know that The economic conditions of our students and families is sort of a predictor of what it will take them to sort of act, to really realize the expected outcomes for student performance. So if you've heard our seen any of our commission meetings, Commissioner Morath will say it's not how much money which sort of drives outcomes, it's whether or not the economic conditions that students are faced with. We need to look at different indicators of poverty. Right now we're looking at free and reduced lunch applications. We know in Austin ISD we serve more kids in poverty than actually turn in the forms, right? We know that there's sort of the stigma around turning in forms, so we're probably serving more kids in poverty than we actually account for. But then there's also sort of the concentration of poverty. There's indicators that are that need to be considered in the home experience that we know are predictors of the kinds of support students will need in order to be successful in education. So those fundamental sort of mechanics of the formula need to be updated. It also needs to account for inflation. School districts are expected to absorb inflation. We actually have, at the Legislative Budget Board actually did sort of an analysis since over 2005. If you look at 2010, school districts in terms of purchasing power, when you adjust for the cost of inflation, we have less today than we had in 2010, and that was like over 8-9 years ago. So we're expected to absorb inflation. There's no adjustment factors that recognize the cost increases for doing business, right? We know that in everyone's home, right, inflation goes up every year, utilities go up every year, the costs for buying goods and services go up, but for some reason, school districts are expected to absorb that. I know it comes at a high price tag. Some had it estimated it costs about $2.7 billion just to adjust for the inflationary factor. But you can't expect school districts to do more in terms of providing supports and services to students who are expected to perform at higher levels with less money than they had even 10 years ago. It just doesn't make good sense. And so addressing those mechanical problems in the funding formula, the outdatedness of the funding formula, and really coalescing around what we expect our students to, we expect them to perform. If it's just one measure, sort of a test-taking measure, then we need to sort of fund that and support that so that all students have what they need to meet those outcomes. And right now, school districts don't have what they need to ensure that every student meets those outcomes, and the outdatedness of the formula means that school districts have had to make tough choices and cuts to even sustain the kind of programming that we had today, let alone the kind of progressive programming that needs to be put in place for future-ready students.
Noelle, Gina, any other fixes that you want to?
I do agree that the cost of education index needs to be updated. So just to put it in perspective, so I'm originally from Brownsville, Texas, which is a recipient of Robin Hood dollars. I support the idea that all schools across the state should have access to sufficient funding for an adequate education, regardless of the property value of the community they are in. That being said, our current system is outdated and skewed in a way that is arbitrary. And let me give you the biggest, the example that I think most demonstrates this. One of the values that's plugged into the formula is called the cost of education index. And that is basically like the cost of doing business or cost of living. And right now, Austin's is equal to that of Killeen's. And we all know that's ridiculous because it costs way more to do business in Austin than it does in Killeen. And in fact, I was on the school board, many teachers can't afford to live in Austin anymore because the cost of living is so high. So Austin needs to be paying its teachers much higher than other parts where cost of living is not as high. So that is one fix. I also think that we need to figure out how to bring in, so let me say that I believe this is a responsibility, a public responsibility. In fact, it's a constitutional responsibility to adequately fund our schools. There's not the political will to do it right now. While there's not the political will to do it, we're desperate for money and we need to find it. And I think we need to be creative too about partnering up with the private sector or business communities and create partnerships, especially in fast growth industries like high tech, where if we look at some of our economic incentive programs, we should look at how do we make those feed into our education system, because that's the missing part of our whole kind of economic vitality in Texas is our education. We need to invest there. So how can we pair those things up? And the final point I'd like to make is that while I do believe there are students who have been served very well by charter schools, and there are some charter schools that are giving kids great educations. I think we need to take a pause on the vast expansion of charter schools right now, because we are now we're at a point where we are spending billions on a parallel school system that we know doesn't take all kids. I had a bill this last session that said charter schools can't keep kids out of schools for having disciplinary records, and we know, because we know that disproportionately affects kids of color, mostly boys of color. And since public schools have to take all kids, charter schools should have to take all kids since they're funded with public money. The Charter School Association opposed that bill. And there are also standards of conduct that charter schools have where they can kick you out if you don't do things like have a cheery disposition or have your parents sign all the forms that you need for school. So we have these two parallel systems. We don't have the luxury of having two parallel systems, one that doesn't take all kids. And so while the idea of charter schools to spur innovation, I think, was a good idea, what is the end game? We're just going to keep growing these charter schools at the expense of our public schools when we've already invested in facilities and communities. It doesn't make sense as a policy position.
Just to play devil's advocate a little bit here, you hear from charter advocates saying that competition among charters and traditional public districts does drive better outcomes. Response on that?
My response to that is that the fact data doesn't bear that out, and we also know they're educating different kids. I have here, for instance, in Austin, we have Means Middle School, we have Garcia Middle School, and KIPP College Prep that's in the same area. And you really, when you look at charter school performance, you need to look in the same neighborhoods, because they should be pulling from the same kids, right? If you look at the population of kids, the kids who are labeled at risk at Means, 78.2%, Garcia, 81.8%, KIPP, 68%. If you look at mobility, this is kids not having the stability at home so that they can stay in one school, which is a big factor that actually our school finance system needs to take better account of. And Austin, last time I checked, had the highest mobility rate of any ISD in the state. Means mobility rate is almost 25%. Breaks my heart when I read. Yeah. Garcia is 19%. KIPP is 3.9%. These are not the same. And so we're creating a system of kids who are easier to educate, and we're investing more, almost $1,000 more per student in Austin and most urban areas in the state of Texas, of state money into charter school kids. $1,000 per kid. So it doesn't make sense. It's killing our public schools, and we really need to rethink the exponential growth of our charter schools.
And if I could add to that, it's not very efficient for the taxpayer. I think the state has sort of made a lot of sort of public laws against public school districts about how inefficient we are and how we're not maximizing our dollars, we're not spending it as effectively as possible, and I would certainly beg to differ. But I would also offer that for the taxpayer, funding two different systems, funding the sort of redundancies on the facility side, that's inefficient. It's not necessarily school districts making different programmatic choices that are inefficient, right? And I would say in Austin, our per pupil spending is high because we invest in things that matter, like full day pre-K, social emotional learning, creative arts, because we know that those things matter for our students, and ultimately it has an impact on their outcomes. But certainly it doesn't mean that we're inefficient per se. But so the inefficiency of running and funding two parallel systems where you're sort of funding facilities and seats on both sides to the taxpayer is resulting in this enormous tax burden, some of which Recapture, right? So Recapture, the state's going to collect almost $4.6 billion in Recapture. And I think that is closely aligned to the allocations, the new allocations to charters. And so I would certainly assert that if we're going to apply efficiency principles to school districts, states should look at sort of inefficiencies as they sort of allocate resources to both ISDs and presumably down the road, but possibly privatization through vouchers.
Right, and when we look at how we're funding our public schools, and the fact that we're relying heavily on local property taxes, where just, with 15 years ago, almost 70% of the funding came from the state. And next year, the Legislative Budget Board is projecting that the state's only going to provide 38% of that, and the local property taxer is going to pick up 62. So obviously, the roles have changed. When the work that we've done within the Texas State Teachers Association and working with school districts to help them pass much-needed tax ratification elections, bond elections to help improve their facilities, right? I mean, all that burden is going back to the local taxpayer because the state is failing in their responsibility. One of the things that I've learned when I've been working with the Donna School Board down in Donna ISD in South Texas, where the median home value is $45,000. I take that same home, and I put it in El Paso, where I'm from, and that same home is valued anywhere from $80,000 to $90,000. That same home here in East Austin is worth almost $500,000. So when you look at the inequities in the system, I mean, that is a flagrant example of how inadequate our system is, and the fact that on average, rich districts pay about 6 cents per $100 valuation less than property poor school districts. And so as long as we continue to heavily rely on the local property taxpayer to pick up the tab when the state and the will of the leadership in our state is not willing to do it, then, I mean, as like Gina said, I mean, we have to be willing to go out, and when you look at your tax bill, that's the biggest portion of your property tax bill is our property schools. Yet, we pay more attention to the mayor's election versus, almost other elections, our school board elections, who's serving on our school boards, who's serving in our legislatures, in our Senate, which is why, as both educators, as parents, as taxpayers, we believe that we should always be looking at how we vote and how we vote in regards to voting education as one of the priorities with our vote, making sure that we have folks that are going to not only talk about funding education and talk about, yes, we are for education, we're for kids, but then at the same time, we'll do complete opposite when it comes to funding our public schools and say, yes, we're for kids, but then also fail to also advocate for the adults that work with kids every single day. And so, that's part of the work that we've been doing in TST is trying to highlight the inequities in the system with the work that, with data that we've been pulling with when we've gone into districts that are really desperately calling for any penny they can get and going back to the local taxpayer over and over with bond elections and rollback elections because the state is completely failing. And, going back to the charter school system, we're basically trying to create a dual system. I kind of compare it to our highway system, where now we have toll roads. So we have highways for the haves and the have-nots. I mean, that's when you look at our public school system, we're creating a charter school and now wanting to look into a voucher system, for the haves and the have-nots and leaving the rest of the kids behind instead of really focusing on developing a strong public school system, and looking at the infrastructure we have and improving that infrastructure and ensuring that our school districts have all the resources they need to adequately provide our students the opportunity that they deserve.
I want to get back to the funding formulas that you were talking about earlier. So what would be the result of updating those formulas?
Well, I'm hopeful that what I see sort of one of the sort of first sort of primary steps is really ascertaining what the student needs are and really quantifying and costing that out. I'm not quite sure how we get there, just sort of retooling or just reallocating the same bucket of money that we have today and maybe curing a few different elements of the funding formula. I'm hopeful that the commission will take up a study that will look at sort of the cost for the provision of services today based upon student population types and needs, because we know there needs to be variability. If we can't just spend $7,000 a student and expect them all to accomplish the same outcomes at a given time. We know that our students are very different and they have specialized needs, and we have to account for those differences. So the hope is that we can update it based upon a cost of what it costs to provide the service and level of support that's expected today for students to meet expected student outcomes. And then we can apply those costs and apply the weightings in a way that makes sense to account for the kinds of conditions that some of our students may face, or adverse conditions that some of our students may face. I think we do need better indicators of poverty. The free and reduced lunch application doesn't work. Property values don't work. Just because you're property wealthy does not mean that you're a wealthy family. It has we know that the regressive nature of property taxes. which is why we're seeing more and more Austin families being taxed out of their homes because they can no longer afford the property taxes. I've spoken to property taxpayers whose the property tax bill actually exceeds the mortgage, right? And so when you have that kind of perverse condition, you have to look at different indicators to kind of account for the intent behind that equalization. We all in Austin know graciously that we have to share. We want every student to have what they need to be successful. I think that the Austin community is very giving towards that, and they bought into a system that where they thought they were going to support other school districts in accomplishing that goal. Right now, we have a flip of inequity, right? The equity that we were trying to solve has resulted in a bigger inequity, right? We have families who are struggling to pay their tax bills, shouldering a far greater share of the public education costs than the state. At one point in the time, the state was about 50%. We're down to 38%. The national average is around 45%, right? So property taxpayers are paying more, and I would say disproportionately, certain low-income taxpayers are unfairly penalized by this system. And so we have to look at better indicators of poverty, both on the student side and for equalization across the state. And so those are the main points that I'm hopeful that we can accomplish through this commission, so that we can reduce the overtaxation that some taxpayers disproportionately share, that's more closely tied to the economic conditions that families are facing in their homes. There's plenty of other indicators that we could consider, but it does require a substantial change, and looking at data differently, and reconstructing formulas, bringing up the mobility, how that sort of accounts for student performance and the impact that that might have. There's a lot of things that we do in Austin. I've been talking to our board because they struggle with this, right? They don't want to set high tax rates. They want to get the tax rate as low as possible. But half of that tax rate is out of their control, right? They can't control the state-mandated recapture component. But certainly we always look to see what we can do, but we shouldn't be trading off things that work for our kids, like the support that we provide for mental health clinics, the support that we provide for social emotional learning. In my mind, those are necessities for our students. And to make those decisions about trade-offs and being more efficient, I just feel like that is not appropriate. I think the more appropriate conversation is, how do we ensure that we have a system of support to meet the needs of all of our students, and how do we fund it, and be transparent about what we're funding and what we're not funding. If we can't fund it all, give the local discretion to allow for meaningful local decisions around whether or not those supports, those activities, those kinds of investments are required in our own local economies, right? Because when we look at sort of business, the things that lure people to the state of Texas is the culture and the sentiment of those local cities. And right now, I feel like there's no discretion in local school districts to be able to treat the things that are important to maintain and sustain that character of that local community. So in Austin, if arts is important to us, we should be able to sustain an arts-rich curriculum and culture, which we know students do better when they have it. But we don't have that discretion to fully fund it right now under the school financing law.
So aside from the rainy day fund, which I think sits at about $11 billion right now, and I think the legislature is unlikely to tap that, if the state were to put more money into education funding or update the weights, where would that money come from? You know, what revenue sources could provide additional funding to schools?
Well, that's the multi-billion-dollar question. That's a hard one. I do think there are places where we can look and be less ideological and more practical about how we spend our money in this state. I'm going to bring up border security. So we know that Republicans put in $800 million into border security, additional money into border security beginning a couple of sessions ago. We also know that it costs about $800 million a year to fund full-day pre-K in this state. If I had to pick, and I'm on the Homeland Security Committee, and I've been to the border, and I saw them seizing marijuana. And let me say, we spend so much money trying to keep marijuana out of this state, and we're not doing it. So I think we need to re-examine what kind of money we're spending on things like border security, and be less ideological about these spending decisions we make. However, these decisions are all political. With that being said, I do think while I agree with Nicole that we really need to cost out what education costs, we need to price it out, and so we know what it costs and study it. Ultimately, these decisions are political. They're made by politicians. And so we need to keep that in mind. And I think one area where, and I say this because what ends up happening is when we do get any little bit of money, we all fight over it and then we all lose, right? And so we need to figure out some win-win situations. And I think looking at our funding for special ed is a win-win, because everybody has special ed, kids who are in special ed in their communities. And we know that the state has not adequately served these children. So it is an ideal opportunity, especially what we read in the news right now about our state special ed system and the caps that had been put into place, that we should look to fund better our special education services for our kids. It's very expensive to do, but it would benefit all districts.
And I think what is desperately needed in Texas is a fair and adequate statewide tax system. You look at corporate taxes, and you look at every time there's a tax cut at the state level, it's always at the cost of something else, right? Something else, most of the time it's education, because that's the biggest portion of the state budget. And so education is always the victim of whenever there's a choice to be made, well, let's cut taxes here, and then we're going to cut education to make up for the cuts in taxes. You look at the lottery. The lottery was supposed to add funding for education, and it did. But what the legislature did was supplant it. Lottery money came in here, and they just took it out the back door. And so it didn't augment and didn't add to education funding. It just was a way to supplant it. And until we actually have the political will from both the governor, the lieutenant governor, and those that are in control of both the House and the Senate to really, we've done a lot of studies. Every session there's a new study that's ordered. And I think, the education community, the public, the communities, the parents, the students, the teachers, we're tired of studies. We're tired of, let's order another study and let's, wait another, 6 months, a year, 2 years to the next session, see what we do. We need action. And, the parents, the students, they deserve better. And, I think when we look at how we tax in the state of Texas, while it's a very business-friendly tax system, at the same time, it's at the cost of our public education. And so we need to have a serious conversation about what's a fair and adequate tax system that both has corporate responsibility and their role in ensuring that there's a fair tax system that they provide in order to then lift the communities all across the state of Texas that's going to feed into their businesses. And so, it's really how do we sit down as Texans and look at the fact that if we truly want education as a priority, and we say that education of our future is a priority, then we need to have the will to really examine our tax system and to make sure that it's adequate across the board, from the property tax level all the way to the corporate tax level, that we're providing an adequate tax funding stream to provide for all of our schools.
Mm-hmm. There's another ideological spending decision that our legislature makes, and that's Medicaid dollars that we're leaving on the table, billions, right, that belong in the state. One of our biggest challenge with our schools are kids with the highest needs. And one effective way that we found in AISD to support schools is through a community schools model, where you have healthcare partners and social workers and English language classes and all sorts of things that a family or community needs, so that a kid can show up ready to learn in school and they're not worried about food on the table, where they're going to sleep, etc. A lot of these things don't always have to be paid for with education dollars. Our schools do it because nobody else is doing it. And in fact, let me say, about having been on the school board of AISD, that is the case so often. We need our cities, our counties, and and other areas to come support our schools so that we can have these community school models that really are helping to lift up a school community so they're just not struggling in a vacuum to make this work. And so looking at healthcare dollars is another way. The mental health care services that we're providing AISD have been phenomenal and a great add to our schools. In fact, the state legislature has looked at what Austin has done, and we should be able to do that in all our schools. But it takes putting people ahead of ideology in making these funding decisions.
If I can, I think you're both absolutely right. We have to sort of get better opportunity. I highlight opportunities for better coordination of services and leverage our campuses more, especially on the health side. I mean, we're sort of a single entity that's spread across the city, which is probably, you know, the case with most ISDs. And so those relationships with other entities, figuring out ways where there's sort of a common or general interest in certain areas to provide access to certain services to students and families is a way that we can sort of maximize the resources across all entities. But as far as I'm concerned, I feel like in terms of statewide revenue, everything should be on the table. I know that certain you know, potential options could be non-starters for the legislature, but I think we should certainly run the course of looking at all revenue options if we are really serious about funding education. And that means, and I believe what you say, education, in my mind, is an economic development investment. And we should be looking at end-to-end, not only in public ed, but in the enterprise funds. Are we maximizing the revenue potential there and really seeing it as a workforce commitment? No more tax breaks, right, until we sort of solve this, or at least understand what that commitment should be from the private sector and sort of owning sort of this economic development investment. And so I think we have to consider all options. We have to consider better coordination amongst all agencies and local jurisdictions to really maximize the resources that we provide through schools and to students and families. But certainly I think we need to consider alternative revenue sources that we may not have considered before. And I know from a philosophical perspective, from a political perspective, some of these things could be a challenge for us, but we may need to consider them strongly.
Are you talking about school closures?
Well, school closures, but not really in this case, but you know, there's the tax bans, right? Taxing more services, expanding the tax base. There's been discussions about the sales tax. There's been discussions about potential of payroll tax or taxing other sort of goods. I do think that we need to go through that exercise and see what the revenue potential is to see whether or not these are things that we could come to some agreements around changing, and some of them might require constitutional requirements to really obtain the revenue. Looking at old things that might sort of be sunsetting, you know, and seeing if it can be applied to school districts in some kind of way. I've been looking at the transportation budget, the economic development budget, where are those things where there might be synergies, where we qualify. Chapter 41s don't get any transportation funding, right? And so I'm trying to figure out what's the best way for us to leverage other revenue streams and maximize sort of the goals of Health and Human Services. If they have a goal of accessing more mental health support or families in poverty, we have them, and we certainly have a placement that would expand access. So how do we coordinate better services at the local level and the state level? And as far as I'm concerned, all the revenue options are on the table, and we should strongly consider them.
Okay. And you know, you mentioned AISD being a Chapter 41 district, meaning the district pays recapture. And so I think this year it's projected to be about 534 million.
Yeah, we adopted a budget of 537 million in recapture payments.
Okay. And that's about how much per, I guess, Austin homeowner tax bill?
The average Austin homeowner, that's about $1,700 on the bill. So even though we represent about 55% of the overall tax bill, almost half of that, almost about 43% of that is going to the state under the recapture laws. So that's that's another feature that I'd like to sort of walk away with, some transparency. Let's call it what it is, right? If it's a state imposed sort of tax, or whether or not there's local discretion. And I would say, even if we wanted to reduce our tax rate to 50 cents, we have no discretion to do so under the current finance law. We're required to tax at that rate because we would still owe the $537 million in recapture, whether or not our tax rate was 50 cents or the $1.789 it is. So there's penalties in the current funding formula that require you to tax at a certain level that is sort of state imposed, and some transparency around that would be helpful in educating our taxpayers around where their tax bills are going. Our chief appraiser did a survey, and most taxpayers don't really understand the tax system or why are they being assessed in the collection. And so that one sort of discrete piece of information could be helpful in explaining to taxpayers why we're contemplating closing schools, cutting full-day pre-K, cutting SEL, cutting their teachers in their local schools when their tax bills are going up in record amounts. At the same time, the local school district is crying that it has a deficit. And so those things don't always comport. And so the transparency would be helpful in helping the taxpayers understand that there's this state equalization component that's imposed on their tax bill.
And while, because property values are so high here, and the district is having to pay that recapture money to the state, AISD still funds on average, their students are still funded at a much higher level. I think it's like $700 more than the average student in the state. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen, it's close to $1,000. When you look at the end of the year in elementary school, it's maybe about $20,000 to $24,000 more per year, about $30,000 more on the high school, and even that is still inadequate, right? Compared to the state average, which is underfunded compared to the national average at about $2,555, that Texas funds less on average per student than the average in the country. And so, you see the challenges that Austin ISD has as a property-rich district that on average spends almost $1,000 more per student. Now put yourself in property-poor school districts, that don't have and that are facing much bigger challenges and revenue, streams that are not there. With a lot of homes, and so it is a challenge. And it's pinning property-poor, property-rich districts against each other when it shouldn't be that way. Right. I mean, property-rich districts, look at the fact that, they're doing the job for the legislature, not adequately funding the schools. And, property-poor districts, even though, for 25 years since Robin Hood have been benefiting from this, it's still inadequate. And as long as we continue to only talk about test scores and the fact that, the only number that we look at is the test scores, not the numbers behind those test scores and the inadequacy across the board, then we're not going to move beyond, what public education should really be about. And I think that's the conversation that's missing is, what is the expectation of a public education in raising our children as part of the community? And, as long as we stay narrowly focused on just test scores and being the only one indicator, because it's the easy indicator, that's the easy one that folks can look at and try to at least understand, and we're not looking at everything else behind it, then we're never going to really move the conversation as to what funding is needed to provide the type of education that we all know our children deserve.
If I could add on the per student piece, I think that utilizing per student funding as sort of a benchmark for where districts should be, I think it's a difficult thing to sort of demonstrate, because how we spend dollars in Austin is dramatically different than some of the most efficient school districts, meaning Cy-Fair, right? They tend to be touted as sort of the most efficient school district. I don't think that I can ever meet the spending profile of Cy-Fair. You have school districts that are near the Gulf Coast that spend so much on insurance, right, that greatly exceeds my costs. You have economies of scales from being a large school district. The urbans, on average, spend more than most school districts. And so the state has like 1,100 school districts, and they range from size of one school to many schools within a district. So per pupil spending doesn't really tell you the whole story, right? I mean, $400 per pupil of that is Social Security. And we're one of just 20 school districts in the state that participate in Social Security. So that's an expense, $33 million, that most school districts will never have to experience. And that's half of the difference that you see in our per pupil spending. And that's a required expenditure. I can't get out of it unless there's an act of Congress, right? The other half, I would say, is because we fund full day pre-K, right? So no one district does it the same way, right? We've invested in some things that have driven up our costs. We're not as efficient, and when it looks at facilities as Cy-Fair, they're a growing district. They have better economies of scales. We know that we have under-enrolled campuses, but for our communities, the challenge of closing schools, right? And this is the difference between a public school and I would say is the difference in a charter and the difference in sort of, I'm not even going there with the vouchers. But public schools, the community feels like they own them, right? And they own the schools in perpetuity, right? We're good at sort of building out new schools. Public school districts are not really good at contracting. We don't close schools, right? But the funding formula is all designed on a per student basis, meaning if you lose students, you really need to reduce your infrastructure. But in public education, teachers and schools are fixed costs to our communities. You try to close a school and it's a huge undertaking. I'm not saying it can't be overcome, but these market sector principles are very difficult to apply when you have governance structures and when you have politics, when you have elected officials and you have communities that are demanding levels of accountability, levels of support and resources, equity issues to contend with. I have students that need nurses in sort of low SES campuses. If I put them there, I have to put them on the high just to ensure equity across the district. So the policy and the political balance that local school districts have to try to achieve because they're accountable to their local constituents, I think is something that the state often sort of puts off when it looks at sort of these market sort of assumptions. But they recognize it at the state level, right? They recognize the politics at the state level, but the local politics, I think sometimes I can't say enough about how difficult it is. I could be as efficient as possible. I could whip our budget into shape and be as efficient as Cy-Fair. But that may not translate well for our students and families if they're automatically having to drive their student to a transportation pickup hub because I've canceled half the transportation services, or because I'm canceling nursing services, or I eliminate the mental health support because I know that charters don't offer the nurses, they don't offer the mental health, they don't necessarily do all the door-to-door pickup for their SPED students. I could be efficient as they are, but that would mean real programmatic trade-offs for our local community that I don't think that they could bear. And so recognizing that within this whole construct is something that we can't ignore.
We're getting close to Q&A time, and I just want to remind the audience members that if you have a question, you can do the South by Southwest EDU app or submit a question on Slido. And so I guess just to kind of wrap up, you know, Nicole, where do you see, and maybe for the rest of you too, where do you see the Texas Commission of Public School Finance headed, and where do you think you guys are going to conclude?
I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, it depends on what day it is. There are days where I'm cautiously optimistic. Yesterday, I was a little less optimistic and was a little bit frustrated. I feel as if there is a sort of tacit understanding that we are going to reallocate the resources that we have. And if that's the case, we're going to get the short end of the stick yet again. And we're going to be struggling, and we're still going to be making hard choices, and our students are still going to be performing at 48% proficiency. We're not going to realize the outcomes that we expect for our students. I'd like for us to get to a place where we recognize the needs of our students. We're willing to make some progress on funding those needs, and maybe we have a plan for how we implement that over time. But certainly, I think it would be a great disservice if we don't recognize the fact that we need to invest more in our students, in what we expect for them, and sustain our school districts to do what they have to do for accountability measures. Our students can't be expected to figure it out all on their own. And I feel as if sometimes this is where we're headed because of insufficient funding. I'd also hope that we can walk away with some flexibility for school districts. A lot of some of the outside of the mechanics of the funding system, there's compliance and over-regulation. I don't know how we got out of the governor's proposal of no unfunded mandates, but the cities and counties got no unfunded mandates, but we are constantly, there's always strings attached and more regulatory mandates. I'm hopeful that school districts can have some level of relief so we can begin to apply resources in a way that makes sense from a practical application, right? If we want to use high school allotment funds to do dropout prevention or hire dropout prevention specialists, we should be able to do that, right? I mean, keeping kids from dropping out is a big way to keeping them to graduate. But depending upon who you call it TEA, that's not an appropriate use for that funds. It's non-compliant. And so I'm hopeful that we can get some flexibility, more funding into the funding formula, and make it more aligned with the kinds of supports that our students need to meet outcomes, and really just making sure that school districts are held accountable to standards, but certainly don't tie their hands with how they get there.
Well, we have about 11 minutes left, and so I'm just going to start going through the questions. Let's see. I think I can highlight. I'm not sure if I'm doing this correctly. It's showing that I'm highlighting it, but it says the previous session discussed intergovernmental collaboration to address funding gaps. What are your thoughts on this and the community schools model?
I mean, I can talk real quick because as an organization, we've been really trying to get our leaders across the state to have conversations with their school boards and introduce the community schools concept, and how we come in and actually bring back, every community has an elementary school. How does that become that central hub of the community, and we leverage all of the resources in that community, to benefit, and not only just between different agencies, but with the business community there locally, with our parents, the community colleges, everybody that's invested in that community, and how do we bring all of those to look beyond the test screen, look at what are the needs of the students, and be able to address those needs on a daily basis. When we look at some of the most challenging school districts and some of those challenging communities, our kids come with challenges every single day that change. And so, being able to leverage the community schools concept model to be able to have teams on the ground, on that campus, to be able to, respond to the needs on that day for that student. Because before they walk into our classrooms as teachers, and, before we can, get into their minds and help expand their minds, oftentimes we have to, feed that hungry stomach, or just some of the basic needs of being cold or not knowing what they're going to go home to. And so, the community schools model is one that we've been trying to, and I know Gina has worked with other legislators trying to actually bring funding to leverage resources from the state and help districts, pick that off as a solution to privatization or turnover, when we can go in and really look beyond the test and say, what are the actual needs in this community? How can we leverage all of the resources to make things better for all of our kids?
Part of the community schools model has to be political, and that means you have to vote. Yep. And I keep coming back to this because Nicole's hopes and dreams that she just laid out for the future of the commission are my hopes and dreams, and we will never get there unless legislators hear from voters that is what is required if they are going to stay in office. Last special session, House Bill 21 was a bipartisan bill in the regular session where Democrats and Republicans came together for a fix in school finance, in our school finance system. It didn't pass because the Senate turned it into a voucher bill. We came back for a special session, and it got turned into a bill that really cut out urban kids for more funding, and it gave charter schools facilities funding for the first time ever. Since then, and it was a partisan vote. Republicans voted for it, Democrats voted against it. Since then, I've heard Republicans say, that was the worst vote I took. I'm hearing from people, I wish I hadn't taken that vote. We need people to hear more of that. Between the regular session and the special session, retired teachers got mad about their benefits being cut, and they had rallies, and then Dan Patrick came back during the special session. He said, this is a priority, and we were all like, since when is it a priority for you? It was a priority for him because he heard from voters who are mad. So we need to make sure that we are all voting. That's how we create the political will to get some of these things done.
And if I could add to Gina's statement on the vouchers piece, I can't not miss this opportunity to say what I speculate how vouchers work. In my mind, the voucher or sort of the privatization of public schools is just a transfer of money out of the public education system into the personal income of those few who have already elected for private education. The cost of private education greatly exceeds anything that we do on a per pupil cost in Austin. I'm sure many of you know the private schools in your neighborhoods, and you can go to see what the tuition is. The gap between what the state is offering and what the cost of that private education is only certainly it precludes certain families from really taking advantage of it. So in my mind, it's just a transfer of monies from one system into those that have already selected a private solution for their kiddos. And then a lot of families don't see that as a solution even for special education. They want their children sort of served in a least restrictive environment, and many times the private options are much more restrictive than what we offer in the public education system. So I would caution, and I understand the tenets behind sort of the privatization and being specialized, but I don't see sort of a parade of new parents and families going to private schools as a result of vouchers. And then I don't see any systems where the student outcomes have been so overwhelmingly progressive or student success where we should yield to that kind of siphoning of public dollars, because that disinvestment into public education means that we're going to have to reduce our size and contract. And that means we're going to have to take out services and supports in the public education system as a result, because there's less money on the table to begin with. So that would be my caution. I haven't seen state systems where student outcomes were so impressive and that I would support a voucher system, but then also I would suspect that the same families that are in private schools today are the same ones that are going to access that new state money, and it's just a transfer of dollars.
We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to try to get to at least a couple of these questions. But it says, what is the connection between the lack of political will to change the broken funding system and the increase in Black and brown children across the state?
I mean, I think that, I mean, I'll when you look at the correlation between the increase in minority population in the state of Texas, and how it correlates to the decrease in funding, I mean, I think it's pretty stark. You look at efforts by, with the whole voter ID and how to suppress the vote, closing certain, polling locations, all of these that have an impact on voter turnout. The fact that, parents are oftentimes working 2-3 jobs just to make ends meet, and how that impacts their ability to even try to get to the poll, when they're trying to just get to, from one job to another. And I mean, there's just so many things that we need to be able to fix in order to make voting easier. I mean, we're really making an effort across the state as soon as kids turn 18 in our public high schools to register them to vote. I mean, I think voting should be automatic. It shouldn't have to be something that you should, even when you go to voter registration card, you still have to put a stamp on it and send it in. So I mean, there's a lot of things that I believe that we could do as a state to promote voting, to ensure that it is a priority. And right now it's, when you look at some of the laws that come into place in Texas, it's more to hinder voting and not actually promote voting.
I think that I hate to blame prejudice for as the single reason why we're underfunding our schools, and I need to make sure it gets out there that the state funded public education. It was a $2.68 billion cut. Thank you for that reminder. I don't know who that came from, but the legislature cut funding for public education this year. I don't think we can just blame it on the fact that now we have a majority of minority kids in our school, but it's there. I've heard it. There's an undercurrent of that. I wished it weren't there, but it is there, and so it's part of what we have to acknowledge. We also have to remember that all of our high school principals are, by virtue of the law, voter registrars and have an obligation to offer all of their 18-year-old students 2 opportunities to register to vote. So they don't have to do anything just by being a high school principal. They are automatically voter registrars.
So what good examples from other states are we learning from? And I'm guessing that's about school funding?
Well, I think that there's some, I mean, it depends on sort of, I don't think that any state has sort of figured out sort of the Goldilocks sweet spot for how to sort of, you carefully balance outcomes and funding. A lot, you know, everyone talks about Massachusetts because it has some of the highest student outcomes, right? But they fund twice as much as Texas. So for those that say money doesn't matter, I don't understand that, because money means everything, right? It buys a teacher, it buys a book. Money definitely makes a difference. And there's research that shows that when you invest in things that counter the adverse experiences that students may have at home or from a societal issue, they do better in terms of student outcomes. I don't know that we'll ever get to the point where we're funding at an adequate level that every student is proficient in our district, because from history would tell me there's an unwillingness to go there, right? Just because of the enormous amount of investment that would be needed. But I'm just hopeful that we can sort of make some progress on recognizing the fact that school districts do need more. They're not inefficient for the purposes of being inefficient, right? I know for a fact, I've been through several years of budget cutting. We've gone through the low-hanging fruit. I talk to school districts every day, and they're cutting their budgets every day. And so if we're investing in something, I can tell you it's a program that means something for a student or a family. It is making a difference in some kind of way. And it's difficult to put our local school boards and our school communities in the position of making those tough choices. And so if we can ease that to some degree and work on a plan that makes progress on sort of really adequately funding our students and their needs, and really look at this as sort of as a full continuum, really reaching out to the transportation, economic development, and really articulating to our general population the importance of investing in education. You might have some racial orientation or political stance, but we all agree that in order to increase the economic sustain the economic productivity of the state of Texas, we have to invest more in our workforce. We will lose ground from a GDP perspective. So there's a lot of economic reasons why it makes sense to make sure that you have a qualified or a workforce that has the basic educational requirements. And so the economic argument in my mind should be strong enough to compel any general citizen, whether or not they're on one party line or another, the importance and the value of education. It's an economic development principle that we all should support.
I appreciate your thoughts. Thank you all for serving on this panel, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.